Okay. Okay, and then
Great. Excellent. Thank you. We're up to 19 or so folks, so we're getting close to the number we expected. So we're going to start. Welcome to the storytelling workshop for AIA Fellowship application. I'm Bob Thiel, FAIA. I am an architect here in Chicago with EXP, and I'm the chairman of the AIA Chicago Fellowship Committee. I have done that for the last couple of years. Looks like we have some good attendance now that we've got some glitches with the Zoom meeting going out of the way. And in addition to our AIA Chicago Fellow applicants, we're joined today by representatives from AIA Illinois, I believe, AIA Prairie, AIA Philadelphia, and possibly some others. So I apologize if I've missed your chapter, but we have a good attendance here from a number of folks that are eager to hear our guest speaker today. This is the second year AIA Chicago is putting on a writing primer for fellowship submission. Last year, I coaxed Peter Exley, FAIA, our past AIA national president, to share his views on how to write a good submission, and he did a wonderful job at the Chicago AIA chapter. This year, we're pleased to have Randall Deutsch, FAIA. Randy is a clinical associate professor at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and he has an undergraduate degree from the University of Illinois and a master's degree from North Carolina State University. He is a published author of several books, including, I love the title of this, Think Like an Architect. So, Randy, I'll ask you to fill in any missing bits of your resume that you wish and turn it over to you for the storytelling workshop.
Thank you so much, Bob, and thank you, Steve, for the invitation. And I am going to share my screen, maybe get a confirmation from one of you that you can see this. Yep, great.
Yep, looks good.
All right, thanks everyone for being here. And let's get started. So 4 years ago this month, I was at AIA Chicago meeting with my mentor for the first time, 5 weeks before we were supposed to submit our applications for fellowship. And I hadn't met with this mentor before. I had previously submitted a draft, as many of you will be doing or already have done ahead of time, so the mentor could read it in advance. And even then, they sat down with me and said, "Who are you?" And I talk about this a great deal in a recent book, Adapt as an Architect. So I'm not going to get into the whole story here, but I really want to point out that who you are is the heart and soul of the question of whether you get advanced to fellowship or not. And this is a diagram I did not share with anybody, including the mentor, but basically I treated my architectural career as an experiment. And every 7 years I changed my side gigs. So for the last 42 to 49 years, I was either educated as an architect or I've been an architect. And every 7 years I'd switch out the side gig. And this made it kind of interesting, but very challenging at the same time to try to figure out who I was and the story I was going to tell. And the mentor had a real problem. So it was less of a mentoring meeting. And I've told Steve this before, and more what felt like hazing in a way, because I wasn't telling my story very clearly. So I had 5 weeks to try to figure out how to do that. This diagram, by the way, it's strange enough that it made its way into a recent business book.
Randy?
Yes.
Randy, I'm going to interrupt you a second. There's a couple people, only a couple of you that still have your microphones on, and we're getting a little bit of echo feedback. So if you could double check the lower left-hand corner to turn your mic off, then we'll do away with that. Thanks.
Thank you. Here I'm showing a slide. This is a room that's about 20 feet from where I'm sitting speaking to you right now. And just to show we're all, as architects, very complex. So while one can say, well, of course, you're a professor, you're going to do public speaking, you're going to be writing books and so on. We all do a lot of different things. And how do we try to figure out what the main thread is that runs through all of that to make a compelling story? So why storytelling? Again, as Bob had mentioned, Peter Exley gave the fantastic talk last year. I would say the main reason is because we're human. And we're meeting today for the first time where we have these large language models that ChatGPT and other tools have been trained on, where we can actually have our stories created in them. In fact, there's several architects, there's evidence of this online, where architects try to figure out whether they will actually get fellowship or not by asking ChatGPT and so on. So from my perspective, if you do your own writing, you will remember the texture, detail, and what it felt like when it took place. Now, this isn't to say you don't work with somebody to help you with writing, but some part of this you have to do yourself because you know yourself best of all. And I also personally believe, I'll say this several times today, it's a missed opportunity not to go through this. So that's a double negative, so let me put it in positive terms. It's a huge opportunity to be able to sit down and try to think about the through line that runs through your career and what it's been all about, and answers the question who you are. So your voice versus marketing speak. Having someone help you with the writing is fine, but having your marketing department in your company may be a missed opportunity. So storytelling is an act of discovery, as I just mentioned. So you'll discover a great deal if you actually sit down and try to do it yourself. Don't miss the opportunity to discover what your journey has been all about. But having served in the past year on the AIA National Architecture jury, you can tell as a juror very easily when somebody, an architect, wrote their own a submittal versus when a marketing department did. And your eyes kind of glaze over a great deal when the marketing department does. And that's part of the reason why I would suggest that you get involved. So again, why story? We covered the fact that it's human, it's compelling. And by that, I really mean it moves things forward. And that's a very important point that I'm going to hit on a couple times tonight. You want to move things forward because there's a relatively short amount of time that your advocate and jurors have to understand your story. Story is the best way to do that. It also builds interest, curiosity, and suspense. Stories persuade, and I have an asterisk next to the word data here because we do need to have evidence. We do, and the application, of course, allows for you to sing your own praises in terms of including data. But data itself, in the form of pie charts and bar charts and so on, without the story, can make a juror's and advocate's eyes glaze over. And it's very hard to convince others to go with you if it's almost exclusively data. So why tell your story? You personally know your own story. Not all architects are good at telling their own stories. And that's why you need to have time, and why we're meeting now in, let's say, 3 weeks from now. You want to plan on carving some time out to arrive at the story. Stories are about transformation. This is true of actual story writing, short stories. I was a playwright for many years. Whatever story you are telling, you are always sharing a threshold moment. Because of you, this happened, and then this happened, and this happened. You made this happen. The application is all about you're telling the story of how you made certain things happen. You want to be able to see your own part, the part that you played in the grand narrative. And that grand narrative is frequently thought of as within the firm where you work. But it also goes beyond that, of course, in terms of the ripple effect of the city, the region, and beyond. Tell the story of your contribution that you've made. And then, yes, you leverage data to demonstrate and make it believable. So many applicants could make the case of falling into multiple objects. And I'm sponsoring one right now who has sort of wavered one way or another in terms of which object to go after. Select the strongest one with the richest story. I like to think of who we are as architects as hedgehogs and foxes. This is, of course, based on Isaiah Berlin's story from 1953. The hedgehog is somebody who is excellent or wonderful at one major thing and repeats it. Think of entering the object under design or project management again and again and again. You've had these successes and so on. The fox, and I fall under the fox category, is somebody who does a number of things well. Maybe no one of them is exceptional. This is a great little cartoon way of visualizing what you do. So again, going back to my diagram of the 7-year career or 7-year side gigs, remaining architect throughout, the fox is easy to remember as the one who does many things well because their tail looks like the successive sigmoid curve or the sigmoid curve. The very act of telling your story possesses power, a story from possible stories. We are complex. There are many stories you could tell. The one that I told in my draft to the mentor was not a great story. They made it very clear in no uncertain terms that I was not telling my story. Basically, it came down to who hasn't done what you've done. You're selecting from any stories you could tell, which story you're going to tell, which is the most compelling, which has the ripple effect, and which has evidence to support it and people to back up and vouch for what you're going to say. That's the best way to arrive at which story to tell. So again, in my 50s, during that decade, I churned out 6 books, and that's a little different. So given all, I'm not going to talk about playwriting, I'm not going to talk about painting. I decided, or cartooning, I'm going to talk about being a public speaker and a book author. And because those have a ripple effect, and particularly in my career, at least during a 10-year period. So you have a 35 or 40-year career, the story you tell may only cover, the heart of the story may only cover 10 or 12 years. In my case, it covered barely 9 years. But in a 40-page submittal, you can have a lot more documentation because maybe you were involved with AIA before the story took place. Maybe there were projects you allude to and you represent in part 3 of the application, for example, and we'll talk about that in a moment, that goes beyond what the story through line is, but supports it. So just as you don't get promoted or win an award for just showing up and doing your work, storytelling is about identifying and emphasizing your quote unquote something more. So my draft of my application 5 weeks before it was due basically said, here's my job, this is what I did, and no, you're not going to get an F or any other kind of award for doing that. I needed to identify a story, I needed to tell it very quickly, and do it in a way that was compelling. So you want to share your knowledge, talents, and skills from outside your firm, and that's how that ripple begins. What is the story ultimately about for you? Why is this story important for you to tell? Is a good way for you to vet the story that you end up with. What moments in your career stick out for you and why? And I actually think this is a pretty good test where if you get excited to tell a family member or especially a friend about something that you've accomplished or completed, or whether you posted on social media, that is a good sign that this is something that triggers something for you and it's important for you. And there's probably, by connecting the dots, you can actually create a compelling story for yourself. You want to showcase your volunteerism, whether that is your involvement with AIA or mentoring or with students by serving on reviews or juries. So how you give back beyond your daily work life is another form of the ripple effect. What you give and do to your, for your community, to students by mentoring and speaking and writing, all of these represent opportunities for taking your through line of your story and amplifying it throughout your application. Again and again, I think I've heard Bob say this as well, that the 35-word statement at the beginning is a little bit like haiku, which is 17 syllables, of course, and it's 575 syllables, 3 lines. You want to make every word count, and we will go through some examples of that. You want to summarize your key message into a very short and memorable phase. Again, the jurors have a relatively short period of time. I'll give you the numbers of the data in a moment. And just like in journalism, as I'm alluding to here in the background, you don't want to bury the lead. In other words, we all have a tendency to, we know what it is we want to say, but a lot of times it takes us a while to get around to that. It's not the fact that your application's 40 pages that may be a problem. It's the fact that you want your advocate, the juror who will be presenting your case to the other jurors, to know what your story is right away, right off the bat. So I'll show you some examples of 35-word statements that work. Actually, all the examples I'm giving here are good. Some are better, though, than others. So I'm going to start off with my own 35-word statement. We'll spend a little bit of time with this. I break it into 3 categories. Peter Exley last year also had 3 categories. His were slightly different. They're both legitimate. Again, everybody that you're seeing today in this presentation made fellowship and made it right away. So, and these are held up as examples for you to be inspired by or to use as a starting point for yourself. So even in 35 words, it's broken down to answering the questions, who you are, what you did, and in my case, why you did it. Let's look at this a little closer. Who I am is a clause before you even get to my name. Book author, so again, not bearing the lead, putting it up front. International keynoter, workshop leader, administrator, and educator. And then here, the what. This person helps current and future design professionals understand the impacts of emerging technology and future practice. So I'm going to have to back that up with lots of evidence, but that's what I am going after fellowship with. And then why do this beyond my job? In other words, maybe this is my job title and that's it. It's just literally my job. But my why is to plan for, navigate, help them to plan for, navigate a fast-moving, uncertain future with confidence. And then when you add up the words, being a writer myself, yes, I wanted to use all 35 words. This is controversial, but a lot of architects I've met, and I taught professional practice for 21 years at the university level, feel that when you're given a budget and you're given a schedule, you want to use every day and every dollar you're given, that it's actually irresponsible in a way not to. I'm using this as an analogy. I think similarly, you're given 35 words. Can you do a statement in 25? Yeah, we'll see an example in a moment, how you can do that and succeed. But I feel like we're missing something when that happens. Not all of us either have the confidence, the wherewithal, or the luck to make it through without exploiting everything that we're given. So I would say the responsible thing to do is it's 35 words for a reason, might as well use it. And again, the 35-word statement is what's up on the stage behind you when you go up and get essentially your diploma, your pin and whatnot. So who, what, and how, as opposed to who, what, why, is how Peter Exley last year talked about his. So here's his statement from 2003. Who am I is answered with his clause at the beginning. And I hadn't seen this of Peter's beforehand, so we arrived at somewhat of a similar conclusion. He's an advocate for architecture and for children. Anyone who knows Peter beyond the AIA knows that this is what he's about. Architecture is fun. What has he done? So again, this middle part is also similar in the sense that it answers the what question for him. And I'm going through these slides somewhat quickly, but we are recording this talk, so you'll have access to it. And there will be Q&A at the end. And then again, I had at the end the why. the meaning, the purpose for why I do what I did. Peter was happy to have how he's actually able to accomplish it, because he was actually able to demonstrate with evidence and get people to vouch for it, for how he did what he did. Why, someone can argue, would make sense for a full-time academic. It's an academic question in some ways, and how is more practical. So either one could work. And then Peter, on his summary of achievements, you're basically given one page. You could break it up into 3 paragraphs, or in this case, more. This is about story, but it's also about making things easy on everybody. Mine is not particularly easy to read, and I'll show you that in a few moments. I had a really hard time getting the color blue down. Reading black on a red background, at least to my eyes right now, if a juror is looking at this, if they're in person and it's on a big screen, that's one thing, but chances are, as you'll see in a moment, many of you know this already, they're given a handful of cases to review, and they might be doing that in their spare time or over a period of time on their iPad. I know for the AIA awards, almost everybody is working off of iPads. So imagine this on an iPad, and it might be hard to read. So part of the story, part of your job is to be that designer. Treat this as a design assignment and make sure that you're getting your message across, not just as a wordsmith, but you're doing so as well as a designer. So this is another example from Kyle Moe. What he did is he's a full-time educator and book author. He took his and floated it in a space. And this shows a great deal of confidence. When you see resumes that have large margins, the argument goes that as a designer, as an architect, as an academic, you're confident because you're given only 40 pages in this application and you're taking up a whole page. One of those 1/40th of your application with this. And then he even goes on to repeat it on the next page in the upper left, which is a good idea because you want to see it in relation to the rest of the text. We'll return to this example in a few moments. So that's the summary section. Here's another one, Christopher Meek's, his statement. I'm not going to read each of these. These are all available to you. As an educator, there were not a lot of examples for me to work off of. I actually had to reach out to, at that time, fellows who were willing to share their applications with me, but there were not education examples. There are a lot of examples for project managers and designers and whatnot. And here's another academic and how they went about theirs. Some of these are challenged from a punctuation standpoint. So again, as a writer, I take exception to the semicolon after the word practice because it slows down things unnecessarily. In fact, if there was no punctuation there, even though that may be incorrect, including putting the AIA with no commas after the AIA or even before it, while that's incorrect, it just reads much faster. And that may be a plus. Similarly, Professor Brous, in this case, after the word pedagogy, had a period. That could have been in a semicolon or just gone right into the next sentence. I'm not going to use this time with you to split hairs, but I will go back and show you some examples of how you can edit and cut and how that can work in your favor. Brian Kowalchuk in 1985 was the very first architect in Princeton, New Jersey that I had ever worked with. And so it's heartening to see him recently become a fellow. And this is his. He starts right off the bat with his name and goes right into what he does and who he is. And this is, and he repeats it here. And again, we'll come back to this as an example. This is a better example in some ways because the paragraphs have these all cap titles. So at the very least, you can see what the subtext or what the individual paragraphs are alluding to. You want the advocate, you want your juror who's representing you, and the whole jury who's looking through this to be able to have an executive summary or read through it fairly quickly and get the gist of what you're about. They know what object you're going after. They have your application. They've read the sponsor's letter. They have a good idea, but they want to see how you put your story together. And a good way to do that is to have headings and subheadings, and I'll give you some more suggestions of what more you can do beyond that. So this example, Brian's, he ghosts images in the back, and that makes the text hard to read. So just like the black text was hard to read on a red background, as great as it was in that it represented the American Institute of Architects, the white, red, and black. This idea, I'm doing it myself in this talk, ghosting in some images behind the text that I'm using, and that at this time of day could, make your eyes hurt. So if it's making your eyes hurt with one presentation, imagine what that's doing to the jurors who have to look at dozens, if not hundreds. So this is from Brian's, and this goes beyond storytelling, but I love this because in terms of ripple effect, more and more over time, we're seeing in these applications more and more maps, especially if you go after design or you've had an impact or the projects you work on have an impact. No better way to show the ripple effect than to do it graphically. It's the equivalent of a metaphor where it stands in for reality. And you can see how far-reaching your effect and contribution has been. And then if you have won an AIA award, you put that little symbol next to it, and you'll go back to that later on in your presentation. This is a fantastic way to help support the story that you started with your 35-word statement. So again, make every word count. A little time for jurors to read every word. For those who feel like 35 words isn't enough to tell your story, don't forget that Ernest Hemingway supposedly had written a story using just 6 words. We are given 29 more, so it should be relatively straightforward. This is another way to actually make it work for you. Because the jurors have little time to read it, and they want to have that executive summary, they're not going to read every word. It's just impossible given the time that they have. They should read every word, and maybe they try if they're speed readers. But you can help them by bolding the really critical things. If you have a through line that goes through your application, bold it, emphasize it with color, italics, different font, all caps. There's a number of ways of doing it without going crazy and making it look chaotic. Here's Joe Caprilli, probably the architect who had the biggest influence on my career in Chicago. I sat next to him for 7.5 years earlier in his career and earlier in my career, eavesdropping on his phone conversations. I learned everything about architecture by not wearing earbuds and listening to music, and by listening to Joe instead. I know Joe, and his summary, while it was successful, which is great, and why there are no singular rules to go by. In other words, if you're hoping to attend tonight's talk and saying, 79% of the time people make it, using more or fewer words and so on, these are all successful cases. So Joe did something, that I personally would not recommend. And I actually, would, because I know Joe, I would add a lot of words that are missing here. He used 25 instead of 35 words. So again, it's not critical. I'm not making criticism because it worked. It worked for Joe. The rest of his application is so compelling that, it actually maybe communicates closer to what his story is by using less. If somewhere in your application, you say what you're all about was, beating up on contractors or saving budget for the client and you're the hero, something along those lines. I'm not saying that that's what Joe did, but if that's the case, then your efficiency becomes part of your message and your story. Then a great way to just, to emphasize that efficiency is use less than 35 words. So his is missing the who. It just emphasizes the what and how. The only who part is his name. So the best 35-word statements captures the juror's attention. They don't read it saying, I've seen this before, maybe 100 times and just in the last hour. There's something special about you, and that's the story that you're telling. You're starting off with a statement. You want to captivate the audience. Think of your 35-word statement as the story you ask the jury to believe, and then back it up with evidence. So over the next couple of slides, I'm just going to suggest to you that when you do write it yourself, even if you're working with a professional writer, to free write. So free write, morning pages, it goes by a number of different names. It's where you just get a blank piece of paper and you just scribble down things that you believe you represent. Sometimes we miss something. We have a 40-page application. We think we're exhaustively talking about who we are and what we're about, and we miss a great deal, not because we haven't saved or collected all the information throughout our career. Some of the best advice I ever got in my life was 20 years ago at AIA Chicago, where somebody said, every time something happens to you, just put it in a box if it's physical, or put it in a computer file and back it up over the years. And then if you ever go after fellowship, you can, open it up, and it's like a time capsule, and you look through it and you go through it. A lot of you have already done that, which is great. If you have to start that today, then there's going to be a little bit of work you need to do. Free writing is a great way to connect the dots, to maybe come up with something or a statement, where we're not so tight, where, there's no mistakes with free writing. The goal of free writing is where you don't lift up your pen and you keep writing to fill up 1, 2, or 3 pages or more. You just keep writing and writing. And then as you're going along, you go back and circle the parts that are compelling or that maybe represent what it is you're trying to say. I think it's really hard to write in a computer monitor. Some of us are better at that than others. I do everything on a yellow legal pad and then transfer it over to the computer. So write long and then whittle down is my advice. Diverge and then converge. So divergent is creative thinking, of course. We generate all the different possibilities, and convergence, this is from my book, Think Like an Architect, is where you are starting to make the choices. You do have enough time right now before, a couple of months before this application is due, to go through this exercise if you haven't already, or if you have, to do it one more time. So you want to use this opportunity for removing redundancies, saying the same thing over and over again, because you want to amplify your initial 35-word statement throughout. And then ask yourself, why say in 10 words what you can say in 5? So in other words, your free writing is creative, it's expansive. And then, when you're diverging and then when you converge, you do want to start picking out the salient pieces that will tell the best and strongest story that represents you. All right, so let's go back to Peter Exley's example. You could say it doesn't really matter. The word has and which are empty words. Any copy editor would probably strike these. Now he's down to 33 words. And for those that say, that take this point and nitpick, there's a couple things to say. One is Peter, of course, in 2003, became a fellow. And so these 2 words didn't stop him. But what I'm getting at is, what's the meaning of 2 words? Well, in mine, if I was only allowed to use 33, I would have to take out with confidence at the end of my statement. And so the point I'm trying to make here is to tell your full story, use everything that you have going for you. Mark Twain, and maybe a dozen or more others that it's attributed to, has said, I apologize for such a long letter. I didn't have time to write a shorter one. And that's the spirit behind what I'm trying to say. It actually does take a little bit of time to edit out, weed out redundancies, and things that just slow down the juror being able to figure out, or your advocate who's going to present your case to the other jurors. It slows them down when you have punctuation and empty words in there as filler. So you do want to go through that convergent phase of editing and paring down until you get to essentially the haiku version of your 40-page application. So there are ways to craft your story and show influences or ripples and growth over time. Of course, there are. One is to think about writing just for one person. You're not writing for the whole jury. First, you're writing for yourself. Again, it's an act of discovery, just to hit on that point one more time. If you do this yourself prior to or alongside a professional writer, still write for yourself, because you will discover something about yourself. I use my 35-word statement in X, or what was formerly known as Twitter, as my bio on it, as the headline, and also on LinkedIn and other places. And I would never have come up with exactly that way of describing what it is I believe in and do. My website is completely based on that 35-word statement. So it's a very valuable thing to go through. Whether you get the F or not the first time around, going through it is the real reward. The next one is your mentor. Many of you or all of you will be meeting with, I believe, I don't want to misspeak here, but in early September or the end of August. And that's the one person who's going to see your draft in the coming days and go through it. So you're writing for that one person beyond yourself. Next, you're writing for one juror liaison or advocate, the one juror who will advocate on your behalf to the other jurors or the whole jury. So what I mean by that is out of 200 plus or minus, so generally speaking, don't hold me to this, some years there are as few as 180 applications, and some years as many as I believe. I've heard 210 and recently heard 240 submittals. There are 7 jurors. They'll have approximately 30 each to read through and advocate. That's why black text on the red background is not going to necessarily work in your favor, nor bad punctuation and additional words. They have something like, and maybe during the Q&A, Bob or Steve or somebody else can chime in, I believe 10 minutes per go through or looking at each application to make your case. So they only have a few minutes to do that. They're not going to take 40 minutes with 1 minute per page and read it. There's just way too many over a 4 or 5 day period to do that. So again, you go back to something like this, and as your advocate, well, first as your mentor, then as your advocate, and then as the jury, and you see a page like this, where do you jump in? You know, the author did not give titles or headings, all cap or bolded or on another color or italicized. It's just a sea of text. It's all good text. It's great text, but did not hold the hand of the jurors. Again, didn't stop this person from becoming a fellow at all. But I know in my own case, I needed everything to work for me. And so I had to take this page and highlight a few things. And again, in Brian's case with that background text or the background image made things difficult, right? You come to a page like this, bless his heart, it looks great because it's got these headings or subheadings to help you get the executive summary of what he's going after or trying to say. And then you can decide where to read in as the advocate or juror, but makes it difficult with that background image. So back up your claims with examples, flesh out your story. You have more breathing room once you get past that section 1 summary. You have more real estate to play with, to use a term from our field. There you're going to be listing evidence and demonstrating in the 3rd section. You want to make it substantial at that point. And again, I'm using this as an analogy. Sometimes when we introduce to our client or to our team within the office, or we want to learn about a new product or new material or building system, we will call the company and they'll send either a sales rep or engineer. Rarely did I ever have both. And there are different times you want to have the sales rep come in and talk, maybe for lunch and learns. Maybe there's times you want the engineer, the former engineer who's now a sales rep, who actually knows the nuts and bolts about the material, the building system. You want to be both of these on your own behalf. You want to be the sales rep up front and then the engineer with the evidence in the 2nd section and the 3rd section. So that asterisk I had next to the word data or data early on is, yeah, you want to use statistics and numbers. And I'm going to use Peter Exley's slides in a moment to back this up or give you a serving suggestion. You want to do this to substantiate your claims, demonstrate or be demonstrative of your impact. And the jurors are more likely to read and remember them. There's a lot of research out there, again, with tweets and Twitter and LinkedIn, where people respond when to posts that have statistics and numbers in them, much more so than just words. So it does help actually to have facts and statistics and numbers, just not exclusively that. Make jurors aware of the value you create. That's the real reason for using statistics and numbers. Reframe your accomplishments in terms of the value you delivered. Don't say that you'd worked on 47 mixed use projects, because that 47th, 46th, and 45th, it's hard to know, after the first 3 of them, okay, I get it. You're an expert at mixed use, projects. It's hard to know what the other ones are doing unless you talk about it in terms of the value you deliver. You know this because those that work with you and for you on your project teams or within your companies also have to redefine what they do in terms of value. Buildings are not just buildings, they change behavior for the better. And that's a great way to talk about the value that they deliver. Hospitals that have windows have shorter stays, people heal quicker. They also report better service, or being, a better experience when that happens, and so on. So how does what you do or design and or make, serve, and sell make life better for your clients and or users, or use whatever words you prefer? So this example, Peter last year showed these 2 slides side by side. This building was featured in magazines and movies. It's that good. Versus this building is about improving the test scores of 500 students. Yeah, if you had to, click one or the other, and we take a survey right now, we're not going to do that. But if we did that, the one on the right would probably be the more effective. But if you take that one on the right and put it on the left, and then you have one that's even more specific and detailed with statistics, 29% more girls are signing up for AP science projects because of my project. Overall test scores in AP science have increased by 37%. That is an improvement. So hopefully we have post-occupancy evaluations, or there have been articles. You have the data to back up some of these claims. So I love this. Just about everybody who presents on PowerPoint repeats this. Tell them what you're going to tell them in your application, then tell them, and by the end, tell them what you told them. You want to weave and integrate your story throughout the whole thing, not just on the first page, and then do a data dump thereafter. Do this so the jury knows you have a story to tell, and not just like this incredible summary page on page 1. Your goal is to deliver an application that keeps jurors engaged, interested, and involved. I love this, actually. This is from William Faulkner, to use another storyteller's example, kill your darlings. What that means is sometimes, whether it's a project, whether it's words or a paragraph that we've used in the past that we are in love with, but we don't have evidence that's really that effective, those are the first things you want to edit out. Edit your list to be supportive of the case or the story that you're trying to make or tell, not necessarily because it's on your CV or resume or on your website. Again, you have to be selective. I love this, thinking about the application where you have to be both selective and exhaustive. The successful cases, successful applications know when to be selective, know when to be exhaustive. Don't cloud your case with and frustrate your jurors with meaningless items. So the best advice I ever heard, I actually heard from my sponsor, Walter Hainsfurther, and he said, write like your mother would write about you. Toot your own horn. This is not the time in your career to be shy or humble. You want to be humble in general, in life. Humility is a good thing. A good statement should make you slightly embarrassed by your achievements. You don't want to overreach, meaning you can't back up the claims you make, but do oversell. Don't share responsibility too liberally. This is probably one of the more controversial things I'll say. Bring your contribution to the fore. So I know in academia, They tell us all the time, if you're on the tenure track, collaborate, 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 but you will not be given tenure. They don't say this part. If you can't prove your independent contribution beyond the collaboration. So collaboration is fine, but you're not going to get tenure. I'm using this as an analogy, not if your object is education. The message is collaboration could be too hard to parse for a jury. We know this in school when we have teams of 2 or 3 students working on a project, or you've interviewed them at your firm, and it's hard to tell who did what on those team projects. It's very similar. This is the time where you want to share responsibility, but you have to bring your contribution to the fore and back it up with evidence. So you want to start with the end in mind, then work backwards from the start. So with any good story, you need to know the end of the story. Any short story writer will tell you this. They need to write the last page first and then start at the beginning. Even if in the first draft, they don't actually work that way, a good story always works this way. So what's the end? When I say the end in mind, yeah, in part of it is the best, Valentine's gift I ever got, the letter saying I got my F. But the real end are the exhibits in section 3. We have a good idea at this point what you're going to be representing in terms of your projects, because I was going after education as my object. I had some projects, some books, some speaking gigs, and it was a mashup of all these things. You want to connect the dots. What is the thread that runs through everything? And in addition to free writing, I recommend mind maps. If you've never used a mind map before, you start with a word at the center and just build out from there. You can look it up. It helps you to answer the question, so what? The mentor juror will ask, why should I care? Why is this application I'm reading through right now, and I'm going to do a pitch on your behalf to the other jurors? Why is this significant? 1,000 other people have done what you purport to have done are very words that I've heard about myself from a mentor, and that really hits home. It hurts for a couple seconds, like pulling off a Band-Aid, but then you have to figure out what your story is. What makes your contribution different? People buy into the difference you make. What difference it made to other people's lives? What value it delivered? What makes your contribution matter? Give jurors a reason to care about you and connect those dots. So connect your story with the sponsor reference letters, right? You're providing bullets, hopefully, to letter writers and your sponsor, and those bullets will relate to your story. It's not too late to go back and do that. I'm a sponsor right now, and I'm writing letters for others at the same time. References and testimonials, think of them as your Greek chorus in terms of a story. They're singing your praises. In the background, you want to make sure it's a consistent story that you tell. This, not everybody does, but I did liberally. I use testimonials. So in that shoebox, in that proverbial shoebox or computer file, over a 35-year period, whenever somebody said something nice in an email or to my face or whatever, I wrote it down, I vouched it with them. Nice things people said about you. Pull quotes create white space within your application, which communicates confidence, but it also provides visual relief. You're not filling up your whole 40-page application wall to wall, margin free, with no white space. So it's easier on the eyes and it breaks up the text. So in my case, you can argue it's hard to read in some ways because the way I use my testimonials. I made all of them in italics and all of them in blue. The jurors, the advocate, didn't need to read them. I made my case with 40 testimonials. If you read them, and I'll explain the value they provided, but the case itself was made in the text in the 3 sections you're given. In this case, I filled up a margin with testimonials instead of images. And again, another one right here, just to break up the text. And if I did a presentation at someone else's firm and somebody wrote me a nice email, I said to Ted Hyman or whomever it happened to be, any concerns if I use this in an application one day. Dialogue is more powerful than narration. I'll make this point really, really quick. I think of when we narrate, it's us droning on and on about ourselves in a 40-page application. Dialogue are testimonials. They're in different voices that are not your own. It does help to break things up visually, but also just in terms, it's like eavesdropping on other people's conversations. Use them as pull quotes, like in a magazine. We like pull quotes. It gives us, again, that executive summary if you want to jump around and read them, and then we can go back and get, they provide specifics, that Greek chorus again, but at the same time, it builds and builds and builds on that ripple effect in the case you're making. It gives vocal variety. So real quickly, just as we wrap up now, I want to talk very specifically in this case. I took my summary at the top. I have these 3 headings or subheadings that are different than Kyle Moe's in the sense that they have these subheadings. So I put my 35-word statement at the top. I use landscape profile, and then I have these headings, and the headings try to have the ripple effect. I educate students and emerging professionals. I also educate the profession, and in these bold sentences below, if you were to read them, I'm backing that up with examples, but not so fine-tuned, because later on, I've got 38 more pages or 39 more pages where I can give examples. And then the ripple effect, educating the industry, boom. And then, instead of using ripple with water, I'm using ripple ice cream here in terms of, reminding you of the ripple effect. The second part are the accomplishments, and that is the data dump in a way. You've got these little square images in the margin or testimonials. And yeah, you want to reinforce the, what you've captured and what you've done in your career. Others who have gone after the design object very clearly spell out, almost like marketing material, what they've done. And that's a very compelling story too. These are different people's, examples from different people's second section. So there's different ways of doing it. Again, if this is on your iPad, you have to question how hard it would be to read, but beyond that. So ways to craft your story: show influences, ripples, growth over time. Show, don't tell is what anyone in a writing class is taught on day 1. Use action-oriented words, be active. Don't just list feats that you've done, but turn them into things in real time, in the present. Make your facts real, and you can do that because architects are primarily visual. You do that by word painting. You're painting a verbal picture of your story. So try to make sure you're not using, even if you're an academic, try not to use these, 50-cent words with 5 or 6 syllables each. Try to find a word that can help paint a picture. Your application is a design assignment. You can drone on and on, or it can persuade jurors to give you your F. And third section are the exhibits, narratives, and synopsis. Here's mine. And in wrapping up, what I want to point out is the synopsis of the challenge, role, and outcome, how you divide up the text. You can add a little more text beyond that about what you work on or what you did. But you want to redefine it in terms of the challenge you were given, the role you played. I mean, that person who's going to sign off on it is going to vouch for the role you played. Here's another one. All great examples of these pages. Narratives, each exhibit should address the challenge presented to you, your role and actions taken, and the outcome and impact of those actions. And I'm not going to read this because this is in your instructions for application. But what I do want to point out is you're reading about the descriptive data for this third section right here. The second bullet towards the end is synopsis. And this is the most important one here. Challenge presented candidate's specific role and resolution or outcome. So again, you have this opportunity to communicate that your challenge and the role you played and the outcome, no matter what you did. And yeah, if you could back it up with a testimonial, it worked for me. These are the testimonials. Sometimes you have more. This is the last slide. So my advice is to tell an F-worthy story. Define and amplify your voice and accomplishments. Make your story compelling. And really importantly, there is no one story that assures fellowship, but there is a better story, and so identify yours. All right, that's it. Hopefully, most of you have stuck around, which it looks like you have, so thank you for doing that. And we've got 7 o'clock exactly. We started a little bit late to make sure everybody can join us. And there's a lot of Steves here with us today.
This has been great. I mean, I started writing down, Randy, some of the highlights of what I would hope to synopsize at the end, but I'm not going to do that. I want to get to questions. But you covered almost everything I could possibly think of, and I'm surprised. There are a couple of things. I'll just mention one, such as free writing, that I fully employed and did when I was putting mine together, and it's an excellent suggestion, but I had no idea that's what I was doing. But you put a name to it and a process to it, so I really would urge, if anything, for all those who are preparing and putting together for submission this year or in the future, go back and look at this video again, because there's so much information that you've done in a very short period of time, but all of it sings really, really well and resonated with me when I remember putting mine together as well. So it's very, very good information. The graphics, the importance of that. It's not going to win you your fellowship just to have nice graphics, but don't overlook it. It's an important thing. Anyway, I'll leave it at that and open it up for questions. Steve, is there anything you need to do to open it up, or how do we want to handle that?
Yeah, why don't okay, Brian has a question.
Great.
So good evening, guys. Bob, good to see you. My main question is it I have a sponsor, he's based out of Milwaukee. Is it recommended that I get a local sponsor with AIA Chicago?
It's not necessary. That's more of a question for me, I think. As long as your sponsor knows you and knows you well and is and can vouch for you and write effectively for you in their cover letter. Their letter is very important, your sponsor's letter, because they really are advocating for you strongly. Yeah, they don't have to be from the same chapter. No. Okay. My sponsor was from Minnesota, so yeah.
Who else has a question?
Let me interject one while people are thinking. Randy, you mentioned having mentors, a mentoring session with someone. Did you? I mean, you are a writer, obviously, so you have confidence in your writing abilities. But how important was it to you to get feedback from others? And I think you touched on that a little bit, but I think people tend to overlook that sometimes. I know I kind of did. I just, hunkered down at my desk and just kept working and refining and refining and refining. But at some point, that mentor reading it really, wow, it opened my eyes to some faux pas that I was just stuck with.
Yeah, so any writer wants to, even if you're self-publishing, and I mean this in terms of writing fiction or plays or something like that, you need to have an editor. We get stuck in our heads. We do this as architects as well. We start believing ourselves, our stories that we tell as being really compelling, or telling the whole story or the best story. And you really want another pair of eyes. It gets us out of our head. That was the feeling I had when I met with the mentor at AIA Chicago 4 years ago. It's this person is reading what you put out there, and some will tiptoe around it and gingerly share with you some feedback, and others will just hit you over the head with what you're not doing. Either way, if you have the intestinal fortitude to stand it, it's really valuable to have people look at it. Have your spouse, have a friend, have somebody who maybe a good writer. This is what I'm trying to say. Is it coming across? Yes, so even beyond that mentor, I found it very valuable to get other people's point of view. Really helpful. Great question.
So Randy, it was an awesome explanation of how to write a story. Thank you very much for your advice. Is it I heard a few times from you, but it happens to me when I have to go and read, proposals and contracts, that the fewer the words, for me is better. And you mentioned that every juror is going to have around 30 packages. So in principle, I don't know if you were very, very specific about it, but in principle, the more compact this stories can be, it could tend to be better, isn't it? As long as the message is still clear, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's the real operative point, that last clause you just added at the end, as long as the message is clear. I mean, you can have 40 pages and 39 are blank and you have one word on one page. If it really, sings and says everything there is to say, maybe that's enough to get you over the fence. So I don't think it's about having fewer words, because you, of course, can have fewer words and still it's a mess. Still it's hard for a juror to find the through line. But yes, if you are confident, from you're getting feedback, you're telling your story, and it's compelling, then yeah, doing it in a succinct way. Again and again over the years, AIA National has always said, or the jurors have always said, white space is welcome. And I think architects roll their eyes at it and don't take it very seriously, or think they're just, we're being given this bad advice to trip us up. It's really the words that count. But I know, as a former employer and head of the grad department at School of Architecture at Illinois, when we see resumes that have white space, it does communicate confidence. It means that you're willing and able to make things work with less. When we look at buildings, whether they're modernist or not, and they just don't try to do too much, sometimes that's subconsciously what we're picking up on as well, that level of confidence. And I think that helps move the story forward when you do that. So yes, I think
that's probably true for graphics, is it too? Graphics as well, instead of having, because my first approach so far, I put 20 years of sketches and things in a few pages, and probably was a mess. Okay.
Yeah, you want to make. Yeah, I was just going to say real quickly, you just want to make sure each one is working for you.
Yes.
And is not redundant. But Bob, go ahead.
No, exactly. I was just going to reiterate that quality, not quantity, is what you're after. If you're putting things in, make sure it's effective and that it's part of the story. You're not just adding gratuitous things like, oh, well, this is pretty cool, I like that. Randy mentioned that about something that's stuck in your head that you really loved from 20 years ago, but maybe it's not really relevant to your fellowship application. So you got to pull that kind of stuff. Don't put in redundant things. Don't fill the page just because you have 40 pages. And I think that's what you're saying about the white space, Randy. Make it effective, make it quality before quantity.
Yeah, and that was the point about kill your darlings. It's the hardest thing we do. We have to do this in projects through value engineering, but we have to do it for ourselves as editors. We're the first and foremost editor of what we're doing before we even give it to our mentor to read our draft. And we have to cut images and cut words because we want to make it so they're willing to take a look at it. Great question. Thank you for it. Appreciate that.
That's much.
There is a
It's very
question.
late in Philadelphia right now, for those from AI Philadelphia. So I don't know if there are any questions from AI.
There is a question in the chat about sponsor, but the sponsor having to be a fellow.
That
That's
one's
a
for me again too. Yes, I'm pretty sure the sponsor does need to be a fellow. Yeah. You want that. Not every one of your reference letters needs to be a fellow, though. You can have, in fact, well, there's a certain number that need to be AIA members, and you'll want to, of course, try to find fellows that can vouch for your abilities and what you're going for. But your sponsor should be a fellow. Yes. They're going to understand what the application process about what it means. I mean, apart from the requirement, it really is going to help you put together a much better submission when you have a fellow as a sponsor.
This is Dave Altmanoff from Philadelphia. Quick question. My daughter is a communications director at a big corporation, and I was using her to help with some of the earlier writing. And not being an architect, of course, she edits out or questions a lot of the buzzwords and kind of archy speak stuff. But at the same time, I feel like some of the things that she was editing out, because maybe she doesn't understand, that another group of architects would completely understand. So do you have an opinion on how much jargon or how much of that to avoid or edit out or not worry about?
Yeah, my take is that if you're talking to the public, say window, and if you're talking to a bunch of jurors for fellowship, say fenestration, I think it's fine. Yeah, so jargon typically you want to avoid, but every book I've ever read about technical writing, which I actually consider this an example of, where you're writing to a captured audience of fellow professionals, you can talk in their language. I think that's fine. The jargon part is where we use words that can mean many, many different things. They're sort of empty words. So I think your daughter's very well-meaning. I think
Yes.
That's a huge advantage to have a communications head as a daughter who's willing to do that. But yeah, put those back in. Her feelings won't be hurt because you know what you're doing. But that's a great question.
Thank you.
And my email is in the last slide if anybody wants to reach out afterwards, if you come up with a question. But again, they're not going to be specific, more about storytelling, narrative writing, things like that.
Okay, any other questions? All right, so what I'm going to attempt to do is we will upload the video of this, and I'll be sending it out. And Randy, if you don't mind, maybe I can send the PowerPoint with it, if that's okay with you.
Yep.
Okay. So that should be a little bit of processing time. So you should have it by early next week. If you don't have it by mid next week, please write to me, because obviously there were some technical difficulties and 4 people were me. So might not know who you were, but just write to me and I will send it off to you. Okay. Okay. And Randy, you can go ahead and hit stop record now.
Okay.
At the bottom.
Thank you very, very much.
Great. While he's doing that, I want to